Good morning and welcome everyone, both those of you who are here in body and those of you who are online. Is it, is it working now? Oh, what a way to start. Okay, anyway, welcome everyone on this rainy April morning. I was telling Shannon earlier that when I was a kid, the saying April showers bring Mayflowers never made sense to me because in my day, we had climate change and there was usually no showers in April where I lived. It never made sense. Anyway, just to start, I guess the first thing, order of business, is just to acknowledge our broadcasting licenses, and thank goodness they're up there and I can read them off to you so that these were all the other things I was worried about today. Accordingly, we have CCLI. Okay, that's not it. CSPL 113699 and one license A-727787. Yeah. Okay. So I think that's all I need to say about that. Welcome, Hadai. Welcome in the name of the Christ. Welcome to this place of blessing, this place of grace, and this holy sanctuary, this place where we discern how to live into the way of Jesus. We gather this morning to share in song, word, prayer, to publicly, intentionally, and explicitly affirm that we are all an expression of the divine's holy light. Be welcomed. Be a blessing. The next order of business is our life and ministry. So does anyone have any announcements that they need to make this morning? Come forward, race to the front.
Good morning. I'm Sandy Long, and I have the nebulous title of I forget what it is, but it's something to do with taking in information and input from the congregation and feeding it back into the music program and vice versa. So I don't get up here very often, but we thought it was time to kind of review where the choir was, where we're at, and where we maybe could be going. And with that in mind, putting together an agenda for a meeting to discuss these things, and everyone is welcome to attend. Things that we want to discuss, for example, that are on the list already are practice times. Now, that's becoming more and more of an issue. We're all getting older, and it seems like, and many people don't want to drive at night, and so our practices at 7:30 are not fitting too well. And yet, for those of us that are working, it's hard sometimes to get home and get a bite to eat and then get back and go to the practice. So we're going to review all those things, and maybe we'll end up with a combination of times, maybe some on Sunday after service or something, and in other cases, some weekday evening, and even during the day for some. major things that's being discussed. We're going to review how we practice for our major performances and have some input based on our experience recently and so on. We want to discuss recruitment and how we get more people up here. And not to be age biased, but it'd sure be nice to have some younger people up here to carry the load. So anyway, so we haven't set a time for this, but we will work on a time and we'll let you know when that's going to happen. Another issue we may discuss is summer choir, and the last few summer sessions we've had kind of an impromptu choir up here, and it seems to work pretty well, I thought. So we're going to discuss how we can build on that. So anyway, my name's Sandy Long. Give me a call, 960-0070, if I remember to turn my cell on, and or to turn it off. That's more important. And we'll just put ideas down here and get them out in front of everyone. Thanks very much.
Hi there, I'm Shannon Carson, and I'm with the Care of Creation team. And Trinity has signed up to help with the City of Prince George's cleanup next Sunday. So if you're able to help out, first thing is to maybe pray for a nicer day. Second thing is to wear appropriate clothing or bring appropriate clothing to change into after church so that you can be appropriately dressed to pick up garbage. You might also want to bring a sandwich. We're going to provide some granola bars, and we'll have some plastic bottles of water, which we will recycle afterwards. And we'll be providing those things, but if you need a sandwich to kind of get you through a bit of work, please take care of that yourself. We could use a couple of trucks maybe to support the picking up of the garbage bags once they're full. And so we'll be leaving right after the church service as soon as everybody grabs a granola bar and water and are ready to go. And we're probably going to have 3 team leaders. And we're going to take off from here and head towards Rainbow Park and pick up in Rainbow Park as well once we get there. And then we drop the garbage off at one of the bins that's set up around the city. So we'll be providing the gloves and the garbage bags as well. But if you can come out and help out, that would be absolutely great. And we'll go as long as you're able. And we'll definitely stop by 3, probably by 2 o'clock. Thanks.
There any other announcements? No. I see Judy Addy isn't here, and she comes and promotes the spring showers for the people in our community who are needing some weather gear for things like umbrellas and ponchos and hats and all those kinds of things. So I believe there's a bin just outside, so that if you have any of those donations that you want to donate, that would be lovely. And it's sort of an ongoing issue, so please, if you have the opportunity, please do that. I think the other thing that I might have been expected to also comment on was the dinner last night. I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to attend or got to enjoy the meal, whether it was here or at home. But we just want to thank everybody who participated in that, the people who took all the time and effort to prepare the food, and those of you who came and or donated for someone else to enjoy the dinner. I wasn't able to attend, but I'm hoping that it was very enjoyable. I'm sure it was. If it was anything like all the other dinners that we have ever had at our church, it was probably amazing. So, okay, so the next, moving on to our opportunities to greet each other and to share the peace of Christ. And all the things that Bob he tells us to do. We can bump fists, we can bump elbows, we can shake hands, we can hug each other only with permission, asked and given. And those of you who are joining us from home, please share in greeting each other in the chat boxes as you're able to. So The normal greeting is, as all of you are probably very well aware, is to greet each other with the peace of Christ be with you and also with you. So take a couple of minutes and move around if you're able and willing, and just greet each other and acknowledge each other's presence, and we'll see you back in a few minutes. All right, thank you. Our first song for this morning, our first hymn for this morning is Joy Comes with the Dawn, Voices United, I can't read it, 166. So please join, stand if you feel able and want to, and thank you. Please be seated. I realized in the confusion of the mic not working that I actually didn't introduce myself. Some of you know me, maybe a lot of you don't. I'm Linda Schmidt, and obviously I'm taking Bob's place momentarily. I was going to make a joke about the fact that he was golfing in Palm Springs, but I don't really actually know where he is, but wherever he is, I'm sure he's doing good works. Anyway, moving along. So it's true. There was a moment that stretched out in time, a moment that felt like all was lost, that nothing would ever be the same again, and it wasn't. Not because what we feared turned out to be true, but because the Holy One dared resurrection, dared to deny death and dismay to have the final word, dared to roll away the stone and release new life from the tomb. That could not contain it. And so we rekindle this light. You need a step stool, Betty. Yeah, I do. It's a little too tall. May is light. Remind us that we too are called to dare resurrection in our lives, in our relationships, in our community, in our world.
Please join me in the call to worship. May we hold our breath and open our ears as we hear God's story. Listen as we seek out the good news in a difficult world. May we be challenged and convicted and forgiven, then challenged, called, and set free again to live out God's story of love and grace in a difficult and hurting world. The gathering prayer is in unison today. Please join me. Gather us in, ground us in your love. Help us to see beyond the trappings of delusion, segregation, and isolation. Instead, empower us to use our actions to be a truth that speaks louder than any words. Beholden us for lives of joyful service and hold discipleship that we should embody the strength of Esther. Amen.
Resurrection is daring. Love is daring. Can we imagine the depth and breadth and height of a love that transcends time and space, that transcends the tomb, that brings new life, even where life was thought to be gone and lost? That's the kind of love and grace that waits to embrace us, to hold and affirm us on the other side of whatever tomb we find ourselves in. With God's grace and love, we too can dare resurrection in our lives as people created in the full complexity of the image of God. We too can embody reconciliation and healing in the world. Our next hymn is What a Friend We Have in Jesus, Voices United, number 664.
Everything to God and praise.
a story for the ages. Our focus reading today is on Esther 2, verses 1 through 18, part 1. Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of this realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young women who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." The advice appealed to the king, and he followed. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jar, the son of Seme, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Mordecai had a cousin named Manasseh, whom he had brought up because she had neither a mother nor a father. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother had both died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa to put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had a charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned her 7 female attendants, selected from the king's palace, and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem and find out how Esther and what was happening to her. The second part of our focus reading is from Esther 2, verses 1 through 18. Before a young woman's turn came to go to King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months of perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. Excuse me. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem in the care of Shastaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, in the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts on royal liberties. In this piece of Christian witness, we see Christ. Thanks be to God.
Good morning again. I was asked by the worship committee via Bob to talk to you this morning about mental health issues and mental illness, which of course, as you can imagine, is a very complex and challenging topic. I was just going to give you a bit of my background. I started working in mental health in 1974 with 3 years at the Foothills Hospital. I worked both youth and adult psychiatry, and interestingly enough, they actually put adolescents with the adults. Can you imagine? It was an interesting experience, to say the least. Then I came to Prince George in 1980 to teach in what was then the 2-year nursing program, and I was teaching the mental health component, which I did for 5 years before moving into sort of more frontline work again. When I first arrived in Prince George to teach, there wasn't a single psychiatrist to be had in our community. Then came Russ and June Fry. Dr. Fry has since passed, and June Fry, I think, is still around somewhere, but they consistently provided the psychiatric mental health services in our community for a very long time. They were joined over the years, off and on, by various people. People came and went. Some stayed for a few years. But generally speaking, on average, we would have had 3 or 4 psychiatrists providing services in our community at various times. Currently, I think we have somewhere around 10 or 12. I haven't really taken count, but that's quite a significant increase in the number of people providing those kinds of services. But even at that, as we all know, we're still not enough. And at that time, our mental health services were limited to the inpatient psychiatric unit, and we had an outpatient department at the hospital, and then we had mental health services in the community that were offered through the Northern Interior Health Unit. In addition to that, we had a few other community programs and stuff, most of which I don't remember now after this many years. But there were a couple of mental health group homes, both of which still exist today. Mary Harper Achievement Center was a program which ran out of a home that was funded by a person was named for her. And it provided a service very similar, I think, to what the ACE Center now provides. Then came downsizing of Riverview, driven by the belief that people needed to be treated closer to their own home communities, and also sort of from the ideology of human rights and believing that institutions were a bit paternalistic and that kind of thing. But born out of those dollars came Iris House, and it is essentially functions as it's kind of a tertiary care, long-term care facility for people with chronic and persistent mental illnesses. We have a variety of other kinds of. It keeps changing. As you can imagine. Things change, things grow. People come up with new ideas for things. We also have a place called Davis Drive, which sort of functions as sort of an intermediary kind of facility. So when people were decompensating in the community, they could go there perhaps instead of to hospital, or people coming out of hospital could be there for a bit to stabilize until they felt ready or were able to find accommodation or whatever that they needed to do. Research taught us that people who were suffering from psychotic illnesses, which are the ones like schizophrenia, schizoaffective, and whatever, were suffering brain damage as a result of those psychotic episodes that they experienced. And out of that knowledge came the idea that we needed to try to intervene as early as possible and engage people in treatment sooner rather than later. And the early psychosis program was born, and it's still present today. Since then, we've had money added to address the issue of addiction and homelessness in our community. And out of that came a program called ACT, the Intensive Case Management Program, and CAR 60, all of which are outreach programs aimed at connecting with and serving the most difficult to reach population and those that are the most vulnerable. And again, whether that's completely successful, still, yeah. I tell you all of this, I think, so you can appreciate that mental health services have grown significantly in the past 30 to 40 years. But as we all know, we still need more. We never seem to have enough. We always seem to be struggling to take care of those people amongst us who are the most vulnerable and having the most difficulties just in their day-to-day life. That's not, of course, to say that there's anybody to blame. The management and the treatment of those individuals with what we call serious and persistent illnesses is complex and challenging. The challenge, I think, in providing adequate resources lies somewhat in the fact that people enter the mental health system of care, but they don't usually leave it. They don't get cured and move on to a healthy life with no need for other services and whatever. They continue to need a wide variety of supports for mental health services in the community at large, including things like housing, finances, medication management, monitoring, general social supports and connections, to name just a few. Many are difficult to engage due to lack of insight and compliance sometimes with their medications. Many have frequent relapses due to substance use and also a variety of other factors. My objective here today isn't to provide you a lecture about the various mental health diagnoses, but rather sort of to just share with some of you some of my insights and experiences, having spent almost 50 years working in this field. Currently, we're inundated with all kinds of information about how people's mental health has suffered, especially in the past 2 to 3 years due to COVID. We hear about the increased substance use, the accidental overdoses, the domestic violence, the suicide rates, young people struggling to catch up socially and academically after forced isolation and online learning. I was talking to a friend yesterday, someone who basically works in a program that tries to engage people of various ages, but tries to engage them in developing life skills and making them, and hoping to return people to either a work environment or a school environment. And she said that there's an increased number of young people in the age of ranges of sort of 14 to 16 that have dropped out of school. I'm guessing probably because these are the people who really struggled with the online stuff and the social isolation and kind of give up, whatever. Yeah, I mean, that's a huge, I don't know, I mean, she didn't give me any numbers, but it was significant to her that she was noticing this change, whatever. But COVID only shone a spotlight on the fact that people have been struggling with their mental health for a long time, and reinforces what we already know about the inadequacies of our mental health and social support resources. It just got worse. But it was like everything else in healthcare. We were always in trouble. We just got into way bigger trouble with COVID. Every act of violence, or every act that is considered to be outside our cultural and social norms and values, is explained by there must be mental health issues. My colleague and I were discussing how this is so overused and so uninformative. The term actually is, what exactly are mental health issues? I don't know. The World Health Organization does provide a general definition, which is as follows: a state of well-being which the individual realizes his or her abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Sounds pretty basic and straightforward, right? But does this mean we are mentally healthy if we meet all of these criteria some of the time? Some of these criteria all of the time? Where does mental health and well-being become not mental health and well-being? So then what definition do we have of mental illness? How do we diagnose those disorders? Are you considered to be mentally ill if you get anxious about standing in front of a group of people? And, you might have a little panic attack. Or you worry about the fact that your partner's late coming home from work, and you imagine all kinds of disastrous consequences for that. Do you have a mental illness if you are sad due to a recent loss, or are overusing illicit substances, or having nightmares after a traumatic event? Whether any of these experiences would result in a psychiatric diagnosis of a mental illness depends on a variety of factors. For example, severity, duration of the symptoms, one's ability to cope with those events, and the impact on one's daily function. Luckily for professionals tasked with doing these assessments and making these diagnoses, we have our own Bible. And it gets bigger every time, so that tells you, does suggest to you the complexity, and it gets more and more confusing and more difficult instead of less. This is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is now in the 5th edition. The first one was brought out in 1952. North America is the only place that actually uses this. The rest of Europe and other countries use what they call the ICD, which is the International Classification of Disorders. And I think they're on their 10th edition, so they're well ahead. We're way ahead of us. I don't know, but anyway. Sorry?
How is that, the European one?
I don't know if it's better. I think it's comparable. I think they are very similar, from what I've been able to determine, but I don't study the ICD. As you can imagine, this is a little bit of light bathtub reading. Okay. But each edition has reflected updates and changes resulting from ongoing research, which enhances our understanding of some of the common features and symptoms of the diagnoses. Some changes came about from social and cultural pressures. For example, homosexuality was listed as a psychiatric diagnosis in an earlier version. That seems pretty ludicrous to us now, doesn't it? Post-traumatic stress is now has been added based on ongoing research, which has increased our understanding about the prevalence of the impact of trauma. However, that is the nature and beauty of research, ever-changing, sometimes confusing and contradictory. Remember, we are now being told that any amount of alcohol is bad for you. A few years ago, a glass of red wine was good for your heart. So what do you believe? Right? It's confusing. It changes all the time. The same thing happened through COVID with the research and the things, and people were confused and angry because we felt like we were getting mixed messages, and couldn't they get it right, and why couldn't they figure it out, right? Because that's the nature of scientific research. The same applies to the research in psych disorders, and I think from my perspective that the technological advances made over the years that have allowed for a more detailed and thorough view of the human brain has begun to change some of the stigma associated with mental illnesses. I often tell my students how embarrassed I am about what I used to teach about what we thought we knew and understood to be the causes of mental illnesses. Some of them yeah, they're really kind of fun. But anyway, now research has shown us that mental illness can be seen by its effect on various parts of the brain. People in our field have often intuitively understood that a history of trauma and abuse was common feature in people that we saw with anxiety and mood disorders, depressions and stuff. Now we actually know that those events actually do change the anatomy and physiology of the brain, resulting in symptoms and the behaviors that we see. We now know that people with schizophrenia, for example, showed impaired performance in completing tasks that require frontal lobe, this part of our brain, such as attention deficits, impaired judgment, decreased motivation, poor impulse control, decreased verbal fluency, and just like anybody who had actually suffered a brain injury, like had suffered a head injury to their frontal lobe, those are the deficits that they will experience. People with schizophrenia experience similar kinds of difficulties. And we have concrete evidence now to show that childhood or any type of ongoing trauma affect various structures and functions of the brain, resulting in emotional, psychological, and behavioral responses that we commonly see. So, I'm kind of hoping that that knowledge, as it gets out there, will destigmatize mental illnesses a little bit and increase our understanding that this is an illness like any other illness affecting any other organ of our body, and we need to stop treating it as, I don't know, whatever we're doing. But basically, as I said, even though we have this wonderful little book, making a psychiatric diagnosis is never easy. We unfortunately don't have any blood work, we don't have any tests, we haven't got anything that we can use to clarify our diagnosis, make it clear. And certainly any of the brain imaging and stuff that they use in research would be far too expensive and far too whatever to actually help us as a diagnostic tool. And in a lot of the diagnoses look similar. How each individual expresses their symptoms in their own unique ways further complicates the picture. Every person with schizophrenia looks different from every other person with the same diagnosis. Anxiety and depression often go hand in hand. PTSD has symptoms of both anxiety and depression. People with ADHD often have difficulties with anxiety and/or depression. And substance use further complicates the picture in terms of, are these symptoms due to the substance or are they an underlying psychiatric illness? Basically, we have diagnoses that fall into the category of what we call chronic and persistent. Those include things like schizophrenia, schizoaffective. Sometimes bipolar may fall into that group. These illnesses are most of us readily recognize and can easily define those mental illnesses because those symptoms are often very noticeable and odd. We readily recognize the overt presentations of those mental illnesses in persons, sometimes at the table next table at Tim Hortons, mumbling to themselves. The vulnerable homeless individuals who suffer from mental illness, who appear scary and bizarre to us. The behaviors that we try to ignore and avoid because we don't know what to do about them. I recall one day sitting in the hospital cafeteria with some of my nursing students and noticing an individual at another table having a very kind of animated conversation. And immediately I'm going, is that person hallucinating? Like what? Then I realized that the person had some kind of earbuds or something that I couldn't see and was having a very normal conversation with an individual. But I have been taken aback on more than one occasion with people walking down the street talking to themselves, but they're not. So it's just your frame of reference, right? That's like that person. What are they doing? And we certainly see it, and we're often kind of intimidated and kind of confused by it. Since the CAR 60 program came into being about 7 years ago, for those of you who don't know, that's a program that pairs an RCMP officer with a mental health nurse. I've worked with that team casually for the time that it's been running, and we get a lot of calls from concerned citizens about what they're seeing in the community, about their concerns about some of the bizarre behaviors that they're seeing and the concerns that they have. And thank goodness people are alert and care enough to make those calls. We always respond and check that out. Unfortunately, the conclusion that we often come to is that the person is functioning at their baseline, which means that this is likely as good as they get. And that's hard for the general public to understand. Our intervening isn't going to make anything better, and often because their symptoms have been exacerbated by whatever substance they likely just took. I know this appears like police and mental health professionals are doing nothing, and there is nothing better than we'd like to do than to be able to fix this. The unfortunate reality is that since we decided that institutional care was no longer an acceptable option of care, we have been left with the option of having to allow people to live at risk. That means we try to provide safe housing, outreach services to ensure they get their medications, to get food and water, assess their mental status, but ultimately we can only do so much. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try harder or that we should give up on finding new ways to engage this vulnerable population and help them achieve their potential for wellness. In my experience, the one thing that has really complicated our ability to successfully treat these individuals is the change in the past 30 to 40 years in the drugs that are now out there. When I first started working in mental health, marijuana didn't really have much of a negative impact on anybody. The THC levels were virtually non-existent. They didn't do a whole lot. Now, because of the increased levels of the THC, actually marijuana can trigger psychotic behavior and psychotic symptoms. So it's not a benign drug. It's not it's whatever. For people who are vulnerable, maybe because they don't know that they have a bit of a genetic predisposition to an illness like schizophrenia, they may, and again, often it's our youth that are using it, and they're already starting to challenge and change their brain, which could lead them to a longer-term illness. Cocaine has probably always been around. It can cause psychosis. It contributes to depression and anxiety. LSD was probably the scariest drug out there at that point. The horror stories I remember in my whatever class of people thinking they could fly and jumping off of things and all that kinds of stuff. But nothing compares to the designer drugs that keep flooding our market. The awful combinations that are sold to unsuspecting vulnerable individuals, which has resulted in these horrific opioid crises over the past several years. I understand now, again, there's even another something being put into the supply. It's a veterinary sedation medication, whatever, and it's having detrimental effects. People combine things that make it Narcan ineffective, right? There's just so much of this stuff going on, and it's so complicated, and so I don't know how we're ever gonna get. So we've seen substance use alone can be lethal, but combined with mental illness, it presents a complex and dangerous threat, complicating and worsening psychiatric symptoms, impacting the effectiveness of medication, resulting in a steady decline in the person's ability to function. Illnesses like schizophrenia tend to rob the individual of their insight and judgment. So we have a complex dynamic of the drugs cause brain damage, the psychotic symptoms cause brain damage, the person's ability to make safe choices about substance using is impaired. The meds that would help manage the symptoms are rendered less effective and becomes a vicious cycle that impacts the quality of life, resulting in anguish and enormous amount of pain for the family and friends of those individuals who are trying to support them and care for them and all that stuff. That is not to say, of course, that every person who has these diagnoses suffers the same fate. Many of our people have really good support systems where we're perhaps treated early and we're able to retain some of that insight and that judgment that enables them to see the necessity for things like their medications and stuff, that they are able to manage the side effects from those medications and whatever. And probably would meet the criteria for the definition that the World Health Organization has provided us about mental wellness. But what about depression, anxiety, things that commonly affect most of us at some point in our lives? Depression has been called the common cold of psychiatric disorders. Sometimes these are chronic and persistent, but more often they tend to get better or get worse, depending on what might be going on in our lives, generally speaking, they don't have quite the same negative impact on our ability to function as does something like a diagnosis of schizophrenia. We all use terminology somewhat loosely. We've all said, I'm sure, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling depressed, I'm overwhelmed, I'm stressed out, I'm burnt out. But those experiences are not always consistent with an actual diagnosis of those things, right? And we also describe ourselves as having OCD. That's mine. I tend to be, I say, oh, it's my OCD. It's kicking in. When I go to organize the mess, it's back here. Yeah, we use terminology quite loosely and quite somewhat inappropriately too, right? Again, we might ask ourselves, what's the difference between what might be considered normal reactions to events and when is it something that needs to be treated? The answer lies somewhat in my earlier comment about severity, duration, functionality, all of those kinds of things. And the reality is that most of us have experienced some of these struggles at some point in our life. Whether they reach the threshold of a psychiatric diagnosis will be different for everyone. Unfortunately, it's as much as mainstream and social media have helped destigmatize, there's generally held myth that somehow suffering from a depression or an anxiety is a failure on our part. Somehow it's a weakness, whatever, which often leads the individual then to suffer in silence because they're basically, they feel like they're telling us that they need to smarten up, they need to stop feeling sorry for themselves, quit worrying. And just as often, the people they might turn to for support are basically saying the same thing to them, like just pull yourself out of the, pull yourself up, whatever. But in reality, none of us ever really knows what's actually going on with someone else unless we actually take the time to ask and listen without judgment. I have lost count of the number of people who over the years have told me how good they are at putting on a good face, at hiding what's really going on with them for fear of being judged or thought to be weak. People who have said, I just tried to tell myself it's not a big deal, that I was exaggerating things, or were told you just need to fill in the blank. My response always is, if it were that easy, I assume you would have already done that. After all, who in their right mind wants to feel depressed, down, anxious, frightened, feel no pleasure in their life, hopeless, helpless, right? Nobody wants to be like that. Nobody wants to feel that. So if it was as easy as just stop it, we would be doing that, and I'd be out of work. And then there's the issue of taking medication. Oh boy, that one really presents some interesting challenges. Again, because people believe that somehow taking medication is masking things, not getting to the real issues. It never ceases to amaze me how willing we are to take medication for any other medical concern. But somehow when the medical concern involves our brain, taking a medication is weakness. You don't understand that. Just recently, I've been back to work with the old team from which I retired 5 years ago, and I was speaking with a young woman who said she had found the medication she was on had really benefited her, but she'd stopped taking it because to her it felt like she was cheating. I mean, I maintained my professional cool as best I could. At that point, I'm going, okay, I don't know where to go with this. But it just, all I could do was try and encourage her and just, try and shift that thinking, because I just can't quite, but it's still their choice. And of course, we have to respect that choice. And that's all I could do was provide that encouragement and support and just saying, there's benefit to this. It was helping you to function. She's a young mother with kids. Seems to me that you'd want to be, but in her mind, that was she was, right, whatever, yeah. I wanted to read you an article that came out in the tragic suicidal death of Robin Williams, and the editorial that came out of that. And the comments that were made in that editorial, I'm just going to read you because this reinforced and said, I've responded to it, but his idea about the medication. This is what he said. The treatment for severe depression is dehumanizing drugs that save people from summoning up the energy needed to kill themselves. But the worst side effect of these medications, on top of the weight gain, the inability to concentrate, and the many others, is they also sap the energy to do the things that bring joy. Many people on powerful antidepressants continue to live in a physical sense, but their interest in being happy and being intimate with their loved ones is dulled to the point of non-existence. He goes on then to say, what does a reasonable person do when faced with unending pain? And the only form of treatment to dull that pain are powerful drugs that would reduce him to a shadow of his former self, a person with his name, but now with the social engagement level of a potted plant. I had to check with my bosses before I replied, because it's a bit of a conflict of interest, but I was given the okay. I'm not going to read everything that I said, but I was very angry with that editorial and the people who read it, and I thought, wow, you've just set mental health and treatment back about 100 years, right? Basically, I was appalled at his apparent lack of knowledge regarding medications used to treat depression in his editorial, and then I just summarized the things that he said. I'm not sure what Mr. Godbout is basing his description of the effects of antidepressants on. However, he is accurately describing the real and painful symptoms of depression itself. The thousands of people have found these medications to be life-saving in more ways than one, and to have someone malign their benefits without any apparent scientific support is careless and disrespectful. People are often reluctant to try medication for the reasons cited, believing they will be zoned-out zombies because of the things they have read. Fortunately, there are such a variety of medications out there that with support and careful monitoring, people can and are helped to return to normal life. And I went on from there. But that was a dismaying kind of thing to have. Anyway, I think I have kind of really gone overboard. I didn't think I would even have enough to but I see it's almost 11 o'clock. So I think on that note, I will end. I think basically it's just, you need to understand that there are lots of new treatments out there. There's lots of new research. There's lots of good things happening that are enabling people to live with, healthy, normal lives kind of thing. And that's what I was going to also talk a little bit about suicide, but I think probably I obviously have way more than I thought I did. Anyway, we'll carry on. I think the next hymn is, Storms of Life. When the Storms of Life Are Raging. Yeah.
Like a ship upon the sea.
Let us pray. I wish some of the prayers that we, for some of the people who have requested some special consideration, include Aaron, the Verge family, Klitsch family, Brian, Pearl and Kevin, Larry T., Jan R., Penelope, Gary G., Jim and Sylvia, Laura B., Ursula F., Bruce C., Jesse, Mac, and all those who are grieving, Charlene B., Clayton B., Maria Rokas and family, Leslie and her family. Keep them in our prayers, God.
Gracious God, in a world of distress, we still come into your presence with praise on our lips, worship in our hearts, and thanksgiving in our being. As we come to you now in prayer, we give thanks today for all that you have shown us, all that you have given us, and for your presence in our lives. We give thanks, O God, that in Jesus we have an example of one who was persecuted, condemned, driven out of his homeland, who grew and continued to be mistreated and mistrusted, who died a horrific death, and dared resurrection to show us a different way, to give thanks because he walked this earth, and in him you know. The human condition you do not stand near, but in the margins of this world, holding on to the persecuted and the condemned, reaching out to be unfamiliar and despised. Help us and all your people to walk your way and embrace the unknown and the stranger. Loving God, in this world of pain, we pray today for all those who have been the victim of persecution, for all those who have been abused or mistreated, for all those living under the fear of what tomorrow might bring, for all those who endure the after effects of some kind of trauma. Pour out your love to them, embrace them, hold them close, and help each of us to grow more conscious of the pain of our neighbors as we seek to be even more caring and loving. Gracious God, speak into this world of hurt. Hear the cries of those in pain and console those in need of you this day as we hold sacred space for our words to fall away and our hearts to speak even louder. Creator, hear these our prayers and use us as part of your ongoing response and daring resurrection as we pray together in a way that unites Christians across time and space.
Give us this day
I did forget to mention that the offering plates were left outside for your convenience, and I also forgot to mention the various other ways in which you can offer your financial support. But just sharing our gifts for ministry. Judy? Let us pray. Into a world where the loudest voice and the greatest might often control the news cycle, take these offerings and help us model a different way of being. Help us to find our strength in silence, combined with action, and in so doing, help us to be in inclusive fellowship with a living faith expressed through joyful service in the community that is anti-racist, where everyone is affirmed. Amen. Our next hymn is It Only Takes a Spark, Voices United 289.